Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hannock here, along with our co-host, Matthew Bartko. We begin, as always, with a short prayer. Direct, we beseech thee, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, that every prayer and work of ours may begin always from thee, and by thee be happily ended. Amen. Today we're delighted to host a group we call the California Four. Desmond Silveira, Brian Carroll, Ed Rushman, and Kevin Egger are each running for office in the coming up very soon, California primary election. Each has ties with the American Solidarity Party. As our listeners know, every week we've been discussing the projects and promise of the Solidarity Party. And by the way, each of our shows is available as a free podcast. Just check in with us at the Open Door Facebook page. Now today, I'm asking each of our guests to get us started with a few words about who they are, what office they are running for, and what goals they would have as public servants. Let's begin with Desmond Silveira.
Hi, I'm as you noted, my name is Desmond Silveira. I'm running for governor. I have been in the American Solidarity Party for a little over 2 years. And shortly after joining, I became a member of the National Committee. My term is about to end this coming June. But I'm currently running for governor, and what I hope to bring to the table is better representation for all of Californians. I'm not representing just the Democrats nor the Republicans. I like to represent everyone, and I think that both of the major parties have trouble representing people outside of their parties.
That gets us going. Now, Brian Carroll, what can you offer us?
Yes, I'm a school teacher in Central California running in the 22nd Congressional District. I have been teaching since 1975, so I have a few years under my belt. Most of that has been in public schools. Some has been in private schools. Some has been overseas. I think as a congressman, in a sense, my job is to be two-faced, and let me explain that. To the 22nd District, I become the face of the federal government. And to the federal government in Washington, I become the face of the 22nd District. So my job is to represent each to the other, and in the process, create a tie, a bind between the voters here and the leaders in Washington, D.C.
Thank you very much. Major enterprise. Ed Rushman is next.
Thanks, Jim. So they say be the change you want to see in the world. I'm Ed Rushman. I'm trying to be that change. I'd like to see us run the government without money involved, without special interests driving everything, and that what we're doing is simply straight up what we're doing, and there's not hidden agendas and a need to somehow cater to the most extreme elements of society rather than going for what really works for a country of this size. So I'm running for Congress. I'm running for the House in the 46th California District. And my main goals are, first of all, to show how a congressman can work. What happens when there's not money involved in everything, when there's not all the dark hidden stuff going on. But other than that, I'm for life. I'm for the DREAM Act. That is my strongest immediate goal in Congress, is to get that passed. And then, of course, things like the environment and peace, a number of other things covered on my website. But really it comes down to governing the way that it should be done and not with all the silly fundraising and favors owed and all that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Kevin Egger, you're from San Diego. Tell us
Correct.
more.
Thanks, James. Yes, my name is Kevin Egger, and I am running for City Council here down in San Diego. District 6 to be specific, which is in the sort of the central northern part of the city, including MCAS Miramar and Mira Mesa as some of the largest segments of that region. One of the reasons why I decided to run was I was unsatisfied for as long as I've been voting with the candidates in front of me on the ballot, and none of them inspired me, say for maybe one or two, but I'm not going to name names right now. And I decided that with the support of my wife that I was going to at least give myself one choice on the ballot that I was wholeheartedly behind, and that would be myself. Some of the items that I want to pursue as a councilman in San Diego revolve around representing the people in our city that are less powerful than average. So what I'm speaking to is senior citizens and the disabled, the unborn, so I'm very pro-life, and then also the homeless population here. Probably the biggest public work that I would want to work on is to provide hygiene facilities for our homeless population after we had over a dozen homeless citizens die on the streets after a hepatitis outbreak this past winter. I'd also like to focus on our infrastructure. It's kind of a boring topic, but I'd like to have higher quality infrastructure that we have here in terms of roads and sidewalks that get repaired, it seems like, every 6 months. And then lastly, I want to focus on increasing the size of our city council from 9 to 21 so that there is actually more representation. The races are more local. Money will have potentially less of an impact because districts are going to be walkable by their own people with their own candidates, and so there can be more face time. And there's more detail on my website as well, on those different items.
Thank you, Kevin. And I want to congratulate each of our California four for their succinct introductions of themselves and of their goals. And I want to interject here that they each have a website, and I'm sure they would encourage each of you who are listening, who is interested, to check out the website. Now, with what I would think we would call good starting introductions in hand, I'd like to go to Matthew Bartko. Matthew, what questions do you have for our guests?
Well, let me give them a little heads up and tell them that if they're not already familiar, one of the questions is going to be about Scott Weiner's proposal about loosening zoning restrictions, in case they need to Google that. And while I'm giving them a second, I'm going to ask our gracious host, Jim, if we're going to be able to post all of their websites on our Facebook page and website.
We certainly can, and let me suggest to each of them, Desmond, Brian, Ed, Kevin, that you email me what's necessary, and I will post it on our Facebook page for WCAT the open door.
Thanks so much for that. I think that's going to help our viewers find them a lot easier. Or I guess I should say our listeners. Praise the Lord that no one's viewing us right now.
Well, you just wait. You just wait till later in the summer. We're going TV.
I've heard that rumor.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
my mother always told me I had a face for radio, so.
So let me start off, and I'll try to address each of you in the order that our lovely host has. So we'll start off with Desmond. What is your perspective on the booming real estate market currently in California as it would impact the people you're seeking to represent? And then if you have particular thoughts on Scott Weiner's potential solution for loosening zoning restrictions, these are topics that members of the Solidarity Party have suggested for topics of conversation this evening.
So I'm not really familiar with Scott Weiner's proposal. I'll have to look into that. But I am very, very familiar with the real estate market here in California. I have a small business rental property. I have 2 apartment buildings out in Upland, California, and I'm a member of the California Apartment Association for the past 18 years. I follow housing trends and am very aware of what goes on. I think so certain cities like Santa Monica and San Francisco and a few other municipalities have tried to combat the housing problem by implementing rent control. I personally think that's a bad decision that exacerbates the problem because that just reduces supply. People stay in the units that they have, and it when there's a greater demand, more people looking for housing, it just leads to a shortage in the housing supply and increases rent values for vacancies. What I'd like to see is a reduction in regulation concerning development, increased developments, therefore increasing supply, and as supply goes up, prices will fall, making housing more affordable.
Thank you, Desmond. Brian, in particular, in regards to the district that you hopefully will represent, what's your perspective?
Well, we are a fairly poor district. Housing prices here are what they are in the bigger cities. I know that in places like Santa Barbara or San Francisco or San Diego, school teachers can't live in the district where they teach simply because of the house prices are so much above what the teaching salaries are. And I understand that part of what the bill is designed to do is to allow some higher buildings, taller buildings, close to public transportation so that people could live farther away from where they work and walk to the train station and be able to get to work. And I think that is a noble cause. I think also where my district has such horrible air quality, regularly when you look at the top 10 smog areas, poor quality air, Los Angeles, Bakersfield, Visalia, Fresno, Madera are in the top 10, and we are right smack in the middle of the Visalia Fresno area. So anything that can help reduce smog is good. The house prices themselves in our district are not bad yet, but we also have the bullet train coming through that will make us potentially a bedroom community for Sacramento, which now is 4 hours away from us. So there's a lot of different things to consider. And of course, as a congressman, I'm not going to be dealing so much with zoning laws and the state regulations, but the cities or the state may come to Congress for some kind of helpful supporting legislation, and I would want to look and see what the individual communities are asking for.
Thank you, Brian. Ed, what is the perspective for the district that you're looking to represent?
Like Brian, our district is a poor district, and we do not have any shortage, though, of relatively high-rise buildings, simply because the north end of our district is a resort area that's wrapped around Disneyland. So there's been quite a bit of developer pressure to go higher, and the city has been good with that. I guess it's good to start off, though, that California is a very desirable place. It's by the normal mechanics of an economy. You have a lot of people wanting something. It's going to be under demand. That's going to drive prices up. I think that's behind a lot of the issues with rising prices. When we take areas and make them higher density by going up, it doesn't really usually have a positive effect on quality of life. It does solve the problem of having a place for people to live. Like Brian said, I do understand the idea here is to have people be able to move, to travel a farther distance without having to add to traffic, and maybe at a lower cost than they would normally have. But there's a number of things involved here. One of the things that concerns me is that this allows developers to drive things, and developers love to contribute to campaigns. In my district, the real estate area and developers are a big contributor to the congressional campaign. Not for me, obviously. So you have the potential here for eminent domain abuse. You know, grandma's been in a house that she raised her children in, and somebody comes in under the idea of highest and best use and says, Grandma shouldn't have this anymore. She's only one person, and for this footprint, we can make a lot more money. Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, we can put a lot more energy-conscious people into that same footprint by going 8 stories up. So we call eminent domain. We take Grandma out, and she can't afford to go anyplace else necessarily, and she may have ties here. So it's a hard thing. I mean, I understand that we want to make the best use out of the land. We want to cut down pollution. We want to do all these things. But there's also the problem of money in politics, and a lot of other interests come into play here. So I have to look at it a lot more closely, but I'm a little bit concerned.
Thank you very much, Ed. Kevin, how do you perceive this in particular, not just for your city, but also for the particular area of the city that you're hoping to represent?
So housing in San Diego is of a concern to me and my wife. We're 31 years old with 2 kids, but we do live in an apartment. And so housing is on our mind. That's something we want to do in the next 10 years. With regard to the bill, I can't say that I'm an expert on the bill at all. What I do have concerns about is any time a higher branch of government wants to control or tell a lower level of government what to do, my hair sort of sticks up a little bit. I'm a big supporter of higher density residences, but I'm not a big supporter of the state telling the local municipalities how they should zone their particular areas. In San Diego, the average home price is $670,000, and the average new home price is around $860. That was the San Diego Union Tribune maybe about a month ago. So single-family homes are normally out of the question for my generation in San Diego. So we need to see more apartments and more condos and more townhomes if we are to stay in the city that we grew up in. If we don't, then either you have to wait until you're in your 40s or 50s to have a house, or you need to leave the state, which on average 14,000 people are net leaving the state every year for the last 17 years. The concern about eminent domain is a large one, and with these types of decisions, you are never going to please everybody. So I believe that the municipality that is closest to the actual zoning regulation should have the final say, and therefore I believe that San Diego should be able to control its own destiny when it comes to zoning for industrial, residential, high density, et cetera, without Sacramento, which is 800, or I'm sorry, I don't actually know how many miles away this is. Probably 500 miles away up the 5, telling us how to zone a particular square footage of our city.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give each of you the chance to answer an A-B style question, but feel free to pontificate freely on the reason behind your answers. The question is, given the choice between making a decision for the common good as you understand it, or representing the will of the people who presumably have elected you, what is your higher obligation? To obey the democratic will of the people, or to do what's best in regards to the common good? And I'll let Desmond start us off there again.
So that's a tough one, Matt. It's not necessarily tough, but it's complicated. It's not straightforward. I'm very much in line with doing what my constituents want, but in this case, I have to balance between what my constituents want and the common good, I will lean towards the common good because I believe that will benefit my constituents as well as people that I'm not necessarily representing. I think that we need to more often look at the community as a whole, our society as a whole, versus what our own best interests are.
Thank you, Desmond. Brian, what's your take on that choice?
Well, I think leaders are elected to lead, and they never want to cut themselves off from the voters, but there are going to be things that are more important to me and other things that are less important to me, and especially in areas where I have declared in my candidacy what I was in favor of, then I would not hesitate to pursue that. Something will come up that I may not have campaigned about at all, and then it's just a question of how strongly I feel on a particular subject. I certainly wouldn't be afraid to lose a re-election because I disappointed somebody. I think back, Abraham Lincoln was a one-term congressman because he voted against the war against Mexico. But I think in retrospect, he made the right choice.
Thank you, Brian. Go ahead, Ed.
I would definitely go for the common good without question. I think anybody that gets to know me, that looks at the site, that listens to the other interviews I've done would know pretty well what I'm likely to go with on almost any subject, not because I've listed it all out, but because of the principles behind what the decisions I make. I do think that part of my job in Congress is to be a consultant for the people, as I've been a consultant for other companies. I'm there to explain the legislation, explain my reasoning, explain, and exactly why it is that this is the common good. And I think that a lot of people will be persuaded by that. And democracy to me doesn't mean being a robot that does whatever the people want. it means that the people every 2 years get to decide whether or not they're pleased with my performance. And if they don't agree that what I've done is in the common interest, then they can elect somebody else. So I take my stand and let them make their choice.
Thanks, Ed. Kevin, what's your perspective?
My perspective would be fairly closest to what Brian had said. I would go with the common good, though, as the foundation. And when something is of relatively small importance, or if I don't have a strong leaning towards one or the other, I may look at the polls. So the foundation is the common good. The connection to that was what I see is that the point of a republic, or the point of a representative democracy, which is what we're all trying to take part in, whether it's a council, a Congress, or the executive of a state, is not, we're not trying to directly replicate the results of direct democracy. We're not trying to poll everybody on every issue. We are there to be who we are, to be a person, to be a representative. And if the voters have given me their vote, and they have sent me to the council to represent me based on how I've presented myself, then any decision that's consistent with my platform would be something that I would pursue, and not allow the polls to guide me unless it was something relatively unimportant or something that I did not have a strong opinion on.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
Say, Matthew, should we, I don't know, it's risky, but should we give Jack Quirk an opportunity here?
Oh, I was unaware that Jack was with us. What a special surprise.
Well, that's
Not to mention John Breen. Let's hear from both of them.
Well, I'm going to be quick about it then, and it is always a risk, but I'm going to have a question for the federal candidates, and if my memory serves, that would be Mr. Breen, Rushman, and Carroll. Am I correct?
Yes, I'm
Silveira.
running for Congress.
Yes. Okay, so let's start with, we'll start with John Breen. What's your feeling about medical care, and how do you feel about single-payer health insurance?
No, I think we got a name confusion here.
I'm sorry.
We've got John Breen, our student, who's now a graduate, who's poised to mop up after you do your worst.
I
bet you're talking about Brian Carroll.
Yes, I am talking about Brian Carroll. My bad.
Yeah, I
And
support
Rushman.
The single-payer health care. I think if you're going to be pro-life, then you have to support the mother and encourage her in every way you can to carry out her pregnancy. I'm running against Devin Nunes, who was part author of the health care bill that the House wrote. The Senate didn't approve it, but the House version that was voted down by the Senate, one of the things it would have done, it would have put a lifetime ceiling on what a patient could collect from insurance, even if it was private insurance. And in a difficult delivery with a preemie that had to spend some time in the hospital, that child could hit the ceiling before they ever got out of the hospital. I don't think you can say you are pro-life and then tell a mother that we want her to continue the pregnancy, but that child will never be able to qualify for health insurance. That, to me, is horribly inconsistent.
And what about you, Mr. Rushman?
I think if I was in an organization that had 330 million members, I think I could probably negotiate a pretty good healthcare deal with somebody. That's just as a first thought. I think that we have to do it in two ways. We need to actually very carefully define what it is we're trying to really accomplish, how we can do it in a sustainable way, and then build a solution. However, I don't care what form that works out to be, as long as it actually works and as long as it's something that we can do for a long time. At the same time, we're going to have to deal with the escalating costs of medical care. And I'm not sure yet what the solution is on that. I think that it may be a hybrid of some of the things that have been proposed. I would like to consider something where providers are compensated based on outcomes. So based on the idea of how healthy they're making the American public, that they get compensated accordingly. I think there's a number of probably 3, 4, 5 different points that I'd be looking to satisfy for each. But quality of care and sustainability would be the top things I'd be having on my mind.
Would you include with that the ability to cover everybody?
Oh, I think you'd have to. At the same time, you'd have to allow some people to go farther. I look a little bit at some of the methods that are out there now where you get a certain level of care that is certainly enough to maintain health. But if somebody wants something extra, they can get an added-on plan or something maybe for that. I think part of the problem is that we've had people do this without really thinking it through. We have that with the current plan, and we really, really need to figure this out and get all the aspects down. Think of all the unintended consequences that usually gets missed. But I do think that there can't be anybody that is excluded from it, certainly.
Very good. Now, Mr. Egger, I almost said Mr. Breen again. Mr. Egger, you're a local candidate, and a lot of issues like zoning and things like that come up. But California has a particular problem that we here in the Midwest don't think about, and that is water use being a particular issue and water shortages taking place. Now, when it comes to, you said you wanted to have a lot of these issues pertaining to zoning be locally decided. But doesn't it also follow that on a state level there has to be a master plan to regulate water use throughout the state?
I'm not sure that it would necessarily be the state level. Typically, you see different regions being divided into different water sheds or different water authorities. So, for instance, most of Southern California, basically from the city of Ventura south, is under one particular authority, pioneered by the men like Mulholland and stuff back at the turn of the 1900s. And we use sources of water that do come from Northern California, but also sources of water that come from Colorado and Nevada and Arizona. So I would not say that I have a position on this, especially as just a city councilman, as water districts are larger than the city. But I would say that it would make sense for something like that to follow along natural boundaries, which would be somewhere larger than the city, but somewhere smaller than the state, for a state the size of California. Sometimes water authorities may actually take up more than one state, say in the East Coast, but at least in California, it does appear that natural water authorities would actually divide the state up into smaller sections.
So would you say that, for example, the construction of a desalination plant should be something that should be handled on that level of water districts?
Correct. If it was possible to distribute that water or to add that water to a particular district's water supply, for instance, we have one desalination plant in San Diego County. It's not in the city of San Diego, it's the city of Carlsbad, but it actually ends up contributing and producing around 10% of the water supply for San Diego County. Now, I'm ignorant of how that's distributed, but I would say that it would make sense that would be part of a water district's authority, not a city or a state.
Right, very good.
Can I interrupt there just to say that when you put desalination of ocean water, you want to put that next to the coast, but by adding water at that place, it does free up water elsewhere in the state. So there is actually a larger statewide need for coordination there.
All right, very good. Mr. Silveira, how are you doing today?
Doing well.
Okay. Notice. Well, let's talk about you're running for governor, and that on the state level gets handled the question of pensions for state and local government employees. I haven't been following it lately. How are the pensions doing?
So I believe that there have been some proposals to adjust the outflow funds from those pensions. Specifically, I think that there's a proposal to increase retirement ages for public service professionals. I'm not entirely sure what position I would take on that, because I don't know the specific numbers involved. But a lot of people have been pretty negative about Jerry Brown. I personally think he's done a fine job when it comes to fiscal matters. And I, if elected, would intend on continuing the fiscal discipline that he has shown over the years.
Would you agree that those who are already retired and receiving their pensions, that that those commitments should continue to be honored?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Anyone that's been promised something, we should not renege on those promises. Any changes would be for incoming employees and future obligations that have yet to be promised.
All right. Well, that's all I have for now. I think it's now Mr. Breen. I get to say Mr. Breen legitimately now.
You can, Mr. Clerk. In passing, I want to say that I think our participants have done pretty well under the questioning of a long-time prosecuting attorney such as yourself.
Yeah, well, you told me you wouldn't reveal my deep dark secrets.
All right. Well, just every once in a while. Now,
Yeah.
John Breen, a recent graduate, and you're even younger than Kevin Egger. What do you have to offer our reflection tonight?
I have a couple of questions. I probably will start with the candidate for governor. Mr. Silveira, there's been some disunity, you might say, for lack of a better word, between the federal government and the state of California on a government level. And one of the bones of contention would be the subject of sanctuary cities. What is your position on sanctuary cities?
So my understanding is that the whole issue of sanctuary cities is the use of resources in enforcement of the immigration enforcement. My position is that it should be up to each jurisdiction to decide what level of commitment they would like to contribute to enforcement efforts. The state as a whole is very immigrant friendly, and I support the state choosing a statewide sanctuary status. But at the same time, if any lower division, any municipality, any county, or any other lower jurisdiction wanted to opt out of that sanctuary status, I would fully support that.
Okay. For our candidates who are running for Congress, perhaps I'm just going to throw the question out, and perhaps you guys can address it in the same way as you were introduced, in the same order. Gentlemen, what are your views regarding the Second Amendment and gun ownership? This is a subject that's not really covered in the American Solidarity Party planks per se. It's not mentioned there specifically, but what are your views on the Second Amendment in regards to gun ownership?
I guess I'll go first here. I think the key word in the Second Amendment is the word militia, and I think that Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to define exactly what a militia is. Currently, it's the National Guards, but I think we could start with the idea that it's a mutual aid society, and it's local. It's not directly under the power of the federal government or control of the federal government, but Congress does have the right to define them. So we could set up a class of militias, for example, that could operate locally, kind of like gun clubs, but they would have the power to register members. We would expect gun owners to find one of them to attach to, so that the guns would not be registered with the federal government, or even state government, which is one thing that gun owners very much do not want. But there would be a community of people that could kind of watch out for each other, and if somebody looked like they were about to go off the deep end, they could rein them in. They would be expected to have training. They would be expected to have insurance. The idea of a militia is group protection. It's not designed to protect a lone gunman that's going to attack a school or a church or a shopping mall.
So in your view, then, do you consider an armed citizenry as part of the checks and balances in our government?
I think so.
Okay.
Thank you, John. Those are good questions, and they elicited some very thoughtful answers. I'm a clock watcher, and Matthew knows that. We have about 15 minutes, and I wonder, we began, as I recall, talking about rent control. And if Matthew would be in charge of rant control, I'd like to, at this juncture, everyone having had his say, and I wish there were somebody on our panel that could have her say, I'd like to raise a couple of philosophical points. And now, Matthew, you're in charge of rant control. So
I got you, Jim.
Let me begin with a particular. It involves a disagreement between husband and wife, my wife and myself. At our parish, St. John Chrysostom in Inglewood, California, a parish which has over 12,000 registered families, our pastor, who's a really thoughtful pastor and really savvy and by no means on the political left, even though I hate to use that term at all, allowed for some folks to set up a table after each liturgy to gather signatures for rent control. Now, my wife didn't sign it. I signed it, and in signing it, I said, I see this as a part of the solution, only a part. And it would seem to me that rent control, were it in place, could be graduated. There could be limits on the rent control. It could be calibrated to new housing going up. All of that is a pragmatic matter, and I'm sure that rent control, even if it were carefully calibrated, would be only one of 10 leaky buckets that are necessary in order to have some sort of a partial resolution to our housing crisis in California. Here in Inglewood, I can immediately visualize 3 major apartment complexes that are going up in areas that are already stifled by the existing traffic. And any number of us are speculating about how this is going to work, because the traffic is a profound problem. And with the adding of major apartment complexes, one of them directly across from our parish church, I just don't know how it's going to work out. Now, that's fairly focused, not a rant, a local particular. But I'm going to go ahead. I'm not going to limit myself to pragmatism, even though someone has said rightly that pragmatism works in theory. But but it doesn't always work in practice because pragmatism isn't particularly visionary. And so I want to say two philosophical things, and I'll try to be very brief. First of all, we've discussed the common good. That's central to the American Solidarity Party. That's central to Catholic social teaching. And in discussing the common good, we need to really distinguish between the common good, which includes everyone, and what we might call maximum utility. Very often, I think, political leaders, in speaking about the common good, are really talking about maximum utility. And there are any number of scenarios in which we can maximize utility by excluding individuals. The common good, by its very nature, includes everyone. And I think we've got to be very, very clear about that when we talk about the common good. The last point I want to make is this. We have to consider where we are, and where we are as well, we're an urban people. Where we are as we're an urban people focused on high tech. But perhaps one of the great promises of high tech is that will help us to de-urbanize. It seems to me one of the things that the American Solidarity Party can offer is a place, a forum to talk about deep alternatives to the status quo. And yeah, here we are in LA, don't I know it? And many of us are in comparable places. But it seems that we ought to think about saying no to hyper-urbanization and yes to not distribution of just a distribution of goods, but a distribution of land and spreading out some, and maybe technology will make that possible. End of rant. Continue, please.
Thanks, James. I think that's a lot to chew on, and there's a lot of good particulars in there. I want to give each of our candidates a couple minutes to just respond to their musings as they were listening to you. Let's start off,
Jim,
with Desmond. If you go too long, I'll be sure to cut you off.
Well, so I agree with Jim. Our party, the American Solidarity Party, is for the common good, common ground, common sense. We need to choose what is best for all and work on things that we can all mutually agree on. Yeah, I don't have all that much more to muse on.
Do you, in particular, find it a difficult distinction between ultimate utility versus common good?
So most of the time, I think the maximization of utility and the common good are highly aligned. Many times they are unaligned in cases where harming one person will help everyone else out. And in those cases, we really need to respect the right of the individual, not violate their dignity, not violate their life. And I believe that is the common good solution, even though it may not necessarily maximize utility.
Thank you, Desmond. Brian, what are your thoughts?
Well, I don't want to turn all you urbanites green with envy here, but my commute in the morning through walnut orchards and vineyards and past blooming plum trees takes about 8 minutes. And there is one four-way stop where sometimes I show up there. I'm the second or third car in line, and I have to wait for the other two cars. So I may have a little bit different viewpoint than the rest of you guys, but I think subsidiarity says the local group needs to make some decisions that are for the local group. Here, our biggest problem is that as developers want to come in and take farmland and turn it into housing and commercial properties, we're in danger of losing our prime farmland. And that's a serious problem. We face very different problems than you guys do in the city.
Thanks, Brian. Ed, where are your thoughts leading you at this point?
I think that we need to keep in mind that there are certain laws of economics, certain laws, if you look at economics as the science of scarcity, there's a scarcity of really, really livable land in the United States. There's a lot of land, but if you really look at population density, it tends to be highest somewhere where there's a sufficient amount of water. This goes back centuries. Water is in some ways, the number one thing. And you might say, well, but you need food. Well, you have food when you have water, because animals, in the old days and things like that. When you have fuel close to it, because if you have a lot of trees growing and stuff, they can be burned in the old days. I think the idea is that we want everybody to have whatever they want, but we do have a scarcity of resources, and there's really no way to have everybody in the United States necessarily have whatever they want. There's an awful lot of people that would like to live in California. Some of them would prefer to live where Brian is. Some of them might prefer to live where I live, where the surfing is better, let's say. But nevertheless, we have the rising cost of housing here because it's a desirable place. And it's going to take a lot of wisdom to make this better when, in a sense, the laws of economics are against us. One of the things that I've seen here is that because the people that can afford to move here and buy land can compete with the people that have lived in California for a long time, they can afford to pay a higher price. It's very desirable to them. And until we find a solution to that, I don't see how it can work, because there'll always be somebody that can pay more for your house if it's in a better spot than the one that they have. So there's just these basics of economics. It's the thing that I probably think about the most, is how we deal with that.
Are you advocating not shipping all the poor Californians off to Mississippi so that wealthier people from around the country can live in California?
It's a funny thing. It's a funny thing that you should happen to say that. I do think that if we could find a way, and this is just my crazy thinking, if there was a way to distribute people more evenly across the country, it would be a lovely thing. I just don't see any way of doing that without practically terraforming areas that are inhospitable. I do think that we could be working a lot harder, though, in some of those other coastal areas like Mississippi and Alabama. I think we could be working a lot harder to make those areas more economically viable. I don't think anywhere near enough attention has been given to that. And if we could make them more economically viable, there would be a natural movement of people into the areas of new opportunity. And it would be a great way of relieving some of the pressure on some of the other areas that have very desirable land by making other land more desirable.
I look forward to future conversations with you along these topics. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts about housing are varied, and I think that whenever we do focus on one particular aspect, we are tempting ourselves to not think about the multi variables that are involved here. In San Diego, so Ed, you were talking about the scarcity drives up the prices, but it is at least in San Diego. Again, I can speak only to San Diego things. So, reported by the Union Tribune, the city of San Diego alone, so we're not talking about other municipalities, takes in over $60,000 per housing unit in fees and regulatory costs. So only one housing developer in San Diego was able to actually, or was willing to give an interview, and he said that the break-even point in San Diego is selling a house for around $620,000. That's where they break even. Before I forget, Brian, you said your commute was 7 minutes. Mine's around 8 or 9 minutes, and I pass through a river valley, although I'm very strange for San Diego because I actually live in the neighborhood that I work. So my commute
Congratulations.
My commute is actually relatively nothing. So that's nice there. Rent control concerns me. I'm not a proponent of rent control because there are so many variables out there that when we try and control them from a government standpoint, I'm concerned that we have about a 0% chance of doing it correctly without tilting the environment in other ways. Now, I could be wrong. I'm not a rent control expert. I'm ignorant of that. But what concerns me is that I feel like there's a very high chance of us getting it wrong, and therefore the balance skews and things go wrong. San Diego's already exporting its poor people, so well over like 70% of our all of the net migration from California involves people that make less than $50,000 a year. People who make over $75,000 a year make up our net increase, according to the Union Tribune. And I'm paraphrasing, so I may have those numbers not exactly accurate, but basically the lower half, the lower half of the numbers results in our export of people, and the higher income is where we get people coming in. But then another thing is that personal choices. When I look at housing and I see living in San Diego, which is not as bad as Los Angeles, and I see the crowding and I see the traffic, I still think, you know what, Boise kind of sounds pretty nice right about now. And and at the end, when we talk about subsidiarity, where people live and who determines what is built where, I think that's a relationship between the individual and their local municipality.
Well, I certainly want to take an opportunity to invite all four of you to the Open Door Facebook page, where we could get into fun topics such as assisting California's homeless population, the effects of redlining on generational wealth in California, and the state's history with racism and migration, and other such softball topics that I'm sure you each can easily, handle should you come into office. But looking at the clock, as Jim would say, Jim, I'd like to invite you to say a special blessing for these candidates that are out there championing the common good, the American Solidarity Party, and the representative republic that is the form of government we hold so dear in this country.
We're coming upon the close of the Easter season, the Paschal season. And in fact, with Pentecost, which we celebrated just this past Sunday, we've come to the climax. I suppose one more week makes it official. So in that spirit, renew the face of the earth, O Lord. God our Father, in the beginning you created the universe, and in the fullness of time you created all things anew in Christ. Send forth your Spirit upon the whole world, and make new all that has grown old under the burden of sin and death. You blew into the clay you had shaped the breath of life. Send forth your Spirit upon the church, and send us forth to bring new life. Thank you, visitors. Thank you, listeners. Our program has come to an end, but we'll be back every week. God bless.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Sebastian will edit out any last-minute overlaps, and so I think we could say good night, and I thank everyone for the special effort involved. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
I gotta say,
Bye-bye.
This was my most fun show so far. Thank you all.
Me too.
Me too.
All right.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.